Rain hammered the windshield, distorting the neon city lights into jagged, glowing scars. Andrew gripped the steering wheel until the leather creaked under his knuckles. 10 minutes ago, he was calmly dismantling a hostile takeover of his shipping routes. Now he was tearing through red lights at 90 miles an hour because she had called. She hadn't said a word, just a choked, desperate sob before the line abruptly died. And in that single second, the untouchable boss of the Carter Syndicate ceased to exist. Cigar smoke hung thick in the air of the warehouse office, stale and bitter. It clung to the cheap wood paneling and seeped into the expensive wool of Andrew Carter's suit. Across the table, a low-level distributor named Rossi was sweating through his collar, stammering out excuses about delayed shipments and seized cargo. Andrew wasn't listening. He didn't need to. The arithmetic of this world was simple. You either delivered or you paid. He stared at his watch. 11:42 p.m. Lucas Brooks stood by the door, a silent monolith of muscle and tailored charcoal fabric. Lucas was Andrew's right hand, a man who viewed the world through a lens of threat assessments and exit strategies. Lucas caught Andrew's eye and gave a millimeter of a nod. The translation was clear. Give the word and Rossi goes in the trunk. Andrew raised a hand, stopping Rossi mid-sentence. I don't care about the Port Authority, Rossi. I care about my margin. Before Rossi could offer another pathetic defense, a sharp, abrasive buzz cut through the heavy air. It was the phone sitting flat on the desk. Not the burner. Not the encrypted smartphone Andrew used for the syndicate. It was the private, heavy steel device reserved for exactly 2 people. His mother, who was in a dementia care facility in upstate New York, and his executive assistant, Cindy Stone. Andrew frowned. His mother's nurses only called during the day unless there was an emergency. Cindy never called this late. She managed his legitimate shell corporations, organized his chaotic schedule, and somehow tolerated the looming, unspoken shadows of his actual profession without ever asking dangerous questions. She was a civilian, a stark, clean line in a life entirely composed of dirt. He picked it up. Speak. Silence on the other end. Not dead air, but a heavy, rustling static. Who is this? Andrew's voice dropped an octave, scraping against the walls of the room. Lucas shifted his weight, suddenly at attention. Rossi shrank back into his chair, forgotten. Andrew. It was a whisper, fractured and wet. Cindy? Andrew stood up. The heavy mahogany chair scraped loudly against the concrete floor. Cindy, where are you? A sharp intake of breath hissed through the speaker. Then, a sob. It wasn't a delicate, cinematic cry. It was an ugly, guttural sound of pure terror, the kind that gets ripped out of someone's chest when they realize they are trapped. A heavy thud echoed in the background, followed by the sound of splintering wood. Please, no! Cindy's voice spiked in panic. Cindy, talk to me, Andrew yelled. Another crash. A man's voice, muffled but aggressive, shouting something unintelligible. Then, a sharp click. The line went dead. Andrew stared at the screen for exactly 1 second. His brain, usually a cold, calculating machine, stalled. Then the adrenaline hit, flooding his system with a violent, freezing clarity. He tossed the phone to Lucas. Trace the GPS, now. Lucas didn't ask questions. He pulled a tablet from his jacket, his thumbs flying across the screen. She's at her apartment, East 42nd. Andrew was already moving. He bypassed Rossi, didn't even look at the man, and kicked the office door open so hard the hinges groaned. "Boss, wait," Lucas called out, trailing right behind him. "We don't know the play. Could be a setup. The feds or the Romanos." "I don't care if it's the entire NYPD SWAT team," Andrew snarled, his stride eating up the distance across the warehouse floor. "Get the car." "I'll bring the team," Lucas pressed, matching his pace. "No time. Just us." Andrew shoved through the exit doors, stepping out into the freezing torrential rain. He didn't wait for Lucas to open the passenger door of the black SUV idling outside. He walked straight to the driver's side, yanked the driver out by the collar, and slid behind the wheel. Lucas barely had time to throw himself into the passenger seat before Andrew slammed his foot on the gas. The tires shrieked against the wet pavement, fishtailing wildly before gripping the asphalt and launching them into the dark. The wipers slapped frantically against the glass, fighting a losing battle against the downpour. Andrew took a corner at 60, the heavy SUV leaning precariously, suspension groaning. "You're going to get us killed before we even reach the bridge," Lucas said. His voice was perfectly level, one hand bracing against the dashboard, the other drawing a heavy Glock 19 from his shoulder holster and checking the chamber. Andrew didn't answer. His jaw was locked, his eyes fixed on the taillights blurring in the distance. He was a man who traded in fear. He had ordered men broken, had watched empires crumble, had sat in rooms with killers and negotiated with a heart rate of 60 beats per minute. But the sound of Cindy's sob kept looping in his skull, deafening him. She was supposed to be safe. That was the unwritten rule of her employment. She handled the spreadsheets, the charity galas, the legitimate face of the Carter enterprise. She brought him black coffee and scolded him for missing lunch. She was fiercely competent, fiercely independent, and she looked at him not like a monster to be feared, but like a difficult man who needed managing. She was 26, drowning in student debt from a degree she couldn't use, sending half her paycheck to a little sister in Ohio. Andrew knew this because he made it his business to know everything about the people close to him. He also knew she had recently broken up with someone, a mechanic named David. Someone she mentioned once in passing, her tone tight and embarrassed, waving away a bruised wrist as a clumsy accident with a cabinet door. Andrew hadn't pushed it. He had assumed it was handled. He was a fool. 4 miles, Lucas said, watching the GPS dot on his tablet. "If this is a domestic dispute gone hot, we handle it quietly. We don't need dead bodies in a civilian residential building, Andrew. The heat will be astronomical." "If he touched her, he's dead," Andrew said. The words weren't a threat. They were a simple, immutable fact of the universe. Gravity pulls downward. Fire burns. If someone hurt Cindy, they stopped breathing. Lucas sighed, slipping an extra magazine into his pocket. "All right, just aim for the chest. It bleeds less on the carpet." They hit the city grid. The traffic was lighter because of the storm, but every red light felt like a physical barrier. Andrew didn't brake. He laid on the horn, weaving a 3-ton armored vehicle through intersections with reckless, violent precision. Cabs swerved, pedestrians scattered. Andrew's mind was a slide projector of horrible possibilities. Every second they spent in this car was a second Cindy was alone in that room with whatever had broken her door. "Please, no." Her voice had been so small, stripped of the confident, professional armor she wore every day in his office. It made Andrew sick. A cold, heavy nausea settled in his gut, replacing the rage with something much worse. Absolute, crippling panic. He had spent his whole life building walls, consolidating power so that he would never have to feel helpless again. Not since he was a kid in the gutter, fighting for scraps. He had money, men, politicians in his pocket. And right now, none of it mattered. He couldn't buy his way through traffic. He couldn't intimidate the clock. "Take the alley on 41st, Lucas directed, pointing at the screen. "It cuts behind her building. We avoid the front lobby cameras." Andrew ripped the steering wheel to the right. The SUV mounted the curb, smashing through a stack of sodden cardboard boxes and tearing down a narrow, brick-lined alleyway. He slammed the brakes, throwing the car into park before it had even fully stopped moving. He was out the door before the engine cut. The rain instantly soaked through his suit, but Andrew didn't feel the cold. He moved toward the rear fire escape of the crumbling pre-war brick building. Cindy lived on the 3rd floor. "Andrew, wait for me to clear the stairs," Lucas ordered, stepping out of the car, rain slicking his shaved head. Andrew ignored him. He grabbed the rusted iron railing of the fire escape and hauled himself up, his dress shoes slipping on the wet metal grates. He took the steps 2 at a time, his breath coming in sharp, silent bursts. The alley smelled of rotting garbage and wet ozone, but all Andrew could smell was the metallic tang of adrenaline. 3rd floor, window. The blinds were drawn, but a sliver of jaundiced yellow light spilled out onto the iron grate. Andrew pressed his back against the wet brick, listening. Nothing. No shouting. No crying. The silence was worse than the noise on the phone. It was heavy, final. Lucas appeared behind him, his gun raised, his chest heaving slightly. He pointed a finger at the glass, then held up 3 fingers. 3, 2, 1. Andrew didn't wait for the countdown. He wrapped his hand in the excess fabric of his suit jacket and punched straight through the glass pane nearest the lock. The window shattered inwards with a loud crash. He reached in, flicked the latch, and shoved the window up. He vaulted into the apartment, drawing his own weapon from his waist in one fluid motion. "Clear right," Lucas barked, sliding in right behind him. The apartment was small, cramped, and completely wrecked. The living room looked like the site of a bomb blast. A cheap coffee table was splintered in half. Books and papers were scattered across the rug. A floor lamp lay on its side, the bulb flickering wildly, casting long, erratic shadows against the cheap beige drywall. And in the center of the chaos, near the hallway leading to the bedroom, was David. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and thick with cheap beer and manual labor. He was holding a heavy wooden baseball bat, his chest heaving, his eyes wild and bloodshot. But Andrew wasn't looking at him. Andrew's eyes snapped to the corner of the room. Cindy was backed against the wall, her knees pulled up to her chest. Her blouse was torn at the shoulder, and a thin, dark line of red trickled from her hairline, trailing down her pale cheek. She was shaking so hard, her teeth were audibly clicking together. David spun around at the sound of the shattering glass, raising the bat. "Who the hell are—" Andrew didn't speak. He didn't issue a warning. He closed the distance between them in 3 massive, predatory strides. David swung the bat. It was a sloppy, telegraphed swing, fueled by rage and adrenaline. Andrew ducked under the arc of wood, feeling the rush of air against his scalp. He stepped inside David's guard, grabbed the man's throat with his left hand, and drove the heavy steel barrel of his gun directly into David's kneecap. The bone shattered with a sickening crack. David screamed, a high-pitched, reedy sound, and collapsed. But Andrew didn't let him fall. He kept his grip on the man's throat, hauling him back up and slamming him against the drywall. The plaster cracked under the impact. "Lucas," Andrew said, his voice entirely devoid of humanity. It was the flat, dead tone of an executioner. "Clear," Lucas responded from the hallway, casually stepping over the debris, his weapon still scanning the small apartment. He looked at David, pinned against the wall, and sighed. Well, so much for quiet. Andrew pressed the barrel of his gun under David's chin, forcing the man's head back. David was blubbering now, tears of pain and sudden, dawning terror streaming down his face. "You have exactly 5 seconds to give me a reason not to paint this wall with your brains," Andrew whispered. I just wanted to talk to her," David choked out, spitting blood. "She wouldn't answer my calls. She thinks she's better than me now with her fancy job." Andrew thumbed the hammer back. The metallic click echoed like a gunshot in the small room. "Andrew," the voice was tiny, a fragile, broken thing. Andrew froze. He turned his head slowly. Cindy was looking at him, not at the gun, not at the blood on David's face. She was looking right into Andrew's eyes, her own wide and completely shattered. "Don't," she whispered. "Please, not here, not in front of me." Andrew stared at her. He saw the terror in her posture, but he also saw something else. He saw the realization in her eyes. She was finally seeing the monster she had worked for all this time. The veil was gone. The polished corporate boss was stripped away, leaving only the violent thug underneath. It broke his heart more completely than a bullet ever could. He looked back at David. The man was pathetic, trembling, smelling of stale sweat and urine. Killing him here would permanently brand Andrew as a nightmare in Cindy's mind. Slowly, agonizingly, Andrew lowered the gun. He released David's throat. The man crumpled to the floor, clutching his ruined knee and sobbing into the carpet. Andrew turned his back on him. He holstered his weapon and took a slow, deliberate step towards Cindy. She flinched, pressing herself harder against the wall. Andrew stopped instantly. He held his hands up, palms open, showing they were empty. "It's okay," Andrew said, his voice dropping to a low, soothing murmur, completely at odds with the violence of the room. "It's over, Cindy. I'm here." He knelt on the floor, ignoring the broken glass digging into the fabric of his trousers. He kept his distance, letting her dictate the space between them. He kicked the door in," she stammered, wrapping her arms tighter around her legs. "I tried to call the police, but he knocked the phone out of my hand. I only had yours on speed dial." "You did the right thing," Andrew said softly. "You did exactly the right thing." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a clean white linen handkerchief. He held it out to her, not bridging the gap, just offering it. Cindy looked at the handkerchief, then up at Andrew. The tears spilled over, cutting tracks through the dust and blood on her face. With a trembling hand, she reached out and took it. Her fingers brushed his, ice cold against his warm skin. "Lucas," Andrew said, not taking his eyes off Cindy. "Yeah, boss." "Take the trash out. If I ever see him in this city again, I'll bury him under it." "Understood." Lucas holstered his weapon, reached down, and grabbed David by the collar of his shirt, dragging the weeping, broken man toward the front door without a shred of effort. "Come on, Romeo, let's go for a ride." The door clicked shut behind them. The apartment was silent again, save for the rain lashing against the broken window and the ragged sound of Cindy's breathing. Andrew stayed on his knees. He didn't try to touch her. He didn't try to comfort her with empty platitudes. He just stayed there, a grounded anchor in the wreckage of her living room. "I'm sorry," Cindy whispered, pressing the handkerchief to her bleeding forehead. "I'm sorry I interrupted your meeting. I didn't know who else to call." A dark, bitter laugh built in Andrew's chest, but he forced it down. She was apologizing. To him. After he had just dragged his darkness directly into her home. "You never apologize for calling me," Andrew said, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't let himself feel in a decade. "Never. Do you understand?" Cindy nodded slowly, her shoulders finally dropping a fraction of an inch as the adrenaline began to leave her system. She leaned her head back against the wall, closing her eyes. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice exhausted. Andrew looked around the ruined apartment. He looked at the broken door, the shattered window, the blood on the carpet. This place wasn't safe anymore. It never really was. "Now," Andrew said, finally standing up and offering her his hand. "Now, I take you home." Heat blasted from the SUV's vents, dry and suffocating, but Cindy couldn't stop shivering. She sat in the passenger seat, her arms wrapped tightly around her ribs, staring blankly at the rhythmic swipe of the windshield wipers. The adrenaline had completely burned out of her system, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache in her bones and a pounding headache behind her eyes. Andrew drove. He handled the heavy vehicle with the same terrifying, quiet competence he applied to corporate acquisitions. His knuckles were no longer white. His breathing was even. If he was bothered by the fact that he had just permanently crippled a man, it didn't show on his face. That was what terrified her most. The absolute normalcy of his violence. For 3 years, she had managed this man's life. She knew he took his coffee black, that he despised morning meetings, that he donated heavily to an orphanage in Brooklyn through a shell corporation. She knew the business he was in. You didn't work for Carter Logistics without understanding that the shipping crates moving through the docks held more than imported textiles. But knowing it in the abstract was very different from watching him shatter a human bone without blinking. "We're going to my place," Andrew said. It wasn't a question or a suggestion. His voice was gravelly, scraping against the quiet hum of the engine. "Lucas has a crew at your apartment right now. They'll pack your essentials, patch the door, and scrub the lease. You aren't going back there." Cindy swallowed hard. "My deposit." Andrew actually let out a short, hollow sound that might have been a laugh. It held zero humor. "I'll write your landlord a check, Cindy. Forget the deposit." She didn't argue. Arguing felt like trying to swim up a waterfall. 20 minutes later, the SUV descended into a subterranean parking garage beneath a massive glass and steel high-rise in Tribeca. The elevator ride was silent, shooting up 40 floors in a matter of seconds. When the steel doors slid open, they stepped directly into Andrew's penthouse. It was exactly what she expected, yet entirely jarring. The space was cavernous, walled with floor-to-ceiling glass that offered a panoramic view of the storm-battered city. The furniture was minimalist, expensive, and completely devoid of warmth. Slate gray leather, polished chrome, dark walnut floors. It looked less like a home and more like a high-end waiting room for a very dangerous executive. "Bathroom is down the hall, second door on the left," Andrew instructed. shrugging off his wet, ruined suit jacket and tossing it over a pristine white chair. Take a hot shower. There are clean towels in the cabinet, and you can take a shirt from my closet. I'll find the first aid kit. Cindy nodded numbly. She walked down the long, silent corridor. Her wet shoes squelched against the hardwood. The hot water helped. It pounded against her back, washing away the dust, the sweat, and the lingering cheap cologne scent of David's rage. She stood there until her skin turned pink, closing her eyes and trying to block out the echoing crack of the baseball bat hitting the floor. But the memory was stubborn, clinging to the inside of her skull like a parasite. When she finally emerged, clad in a pair of Andrew's oversized gray sweatpants, with the drawstring pulled as tight as it would go, and a black t-shirt that hung past her thighs, she found him waiting in the kitchen. He was sitting on a bar stool at the Marble Island. He had changed into dry clothes, a simple black crewneck and dark jeans. It was the most casual she had ever seen him, yet he still looked coiled, like a spring wound too tight. A gray plastic medical box sat open on the counter. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the stool beside him. Cindy hesitated, hovering at the edge of the kitchen. The kitchen lights were bright, surgical. They left nothing to hide behind. "Andrew, you don't have to. Sit, Cindy." His tone was softer this time, but the command remained. She walked over and climbed onto the high stool. She felt small. She hated feeling small. Andrew pulled a small bottle of antiseptic from the kit, along with a sterile cotton pad. "Look at me." She raised her chin. He leaned in. He smelled like expensive soap and the faint, lingering metallic tang of rain. Up close, the lines of exhaustion around his eyes were deeply etched. He tipped the bottle, soaking the pad, and gently pressed it against the cut near her hairline. Cindy hissed, instinctively jerking back. "I know. I'm sorry," Andrew murmured. His hand moved to her shoulder, a large, warm weight holding her steady. He didn't grip her tightly. It was just a physical anchor. "Hold still. It needs to be cleaned." He worked methodically. His hands, which had so effortlessly dismantled a man an hour ago, were impossibly steady and precise. He cleaned the dried blood, examined the gash, and applied a thin butterfly bandage. "You don't need stitches," he said quietly, his eyes focused on her forehead. "But you're going to have a hell of a bruise." "David was drunk," Cindy said. The words tumbled out of her mouth before she could stop them. It felt necessary to fill the heavy silence, to rationalize the madness. "He got fired yesterday. He blamed me. Said I thought I was too good for him because I work in a high-rise." Andrew stopped wiping her forehead. He lowered the cotton pad. His eyes dropped to hers, dark and unreadable. "I don't care why he did it," Andrew said flatly. "I don't care about his job or his alcohol tolerance or his fragile ego. The only thing that matters is that he crossed a line." "You broke his leg." "I shattered his patella," Andrew corrected, throwing the bloody cotton pad into the trash can. "He'll walk with a limp for the rest of his life. And he's lucky that's all I broke." Cindy stared at him. The cynicism she wore like armor every day at the office felt very thin right now. "You were going to shoot him." "Yes." He didn't deflect. He didn't try to soften it. He simply told her the truth, and the raw honesty of it hit her like a physical blow. "Why didn't you?" she whispered. Andrew capped the antiseptic bottle. He placed it back in the plastic box, aligning it perfectly with the gauze. He took a very long time answering. "Because you asked me not to," he finally said, not looking at her. "And because I realized that if I put a bullet in his head in your living room, you would never be able to look at me again without seeing a murderer." He closed the lid of the first aid kit with a sharp snap. "You can take the guest bedroom. It's the last door on the right. Lock it if it makes you feel better." He stood up, turning his back to her, creating an immediate physical wall between them. "Try to sleep. We'll deal with the rest tomorrow." He walked out of the kitchen, disappearing into the shadows of the massive penthouse, leaving Cindy alone with the stark, humming silence of the refrigerator and a heart that was beating much too fast. Morning arrived without sunshine. The storm had passed, but it left behind a low ceiling of oppressive, slate-gray clouds that choked the New York skyline. Cindy woke up, staring at an unfamiliar ceiling. The sheets were high-threaded count Egyptian cotton, heavy and suffocating. For 3 seconds, she didn't know where she was. Then the dull throb in her temple flared, and the memory of the splintering door crashed down on her. She sat up, swinging her legs over the edge of the mattress. The oversized sweatpants bunched around her ankles. She felt exhausted, as if she had slept for a decade, but hadn't rested for a single minute. She padded barefoot out of the guest room. The penthouse was quiet, but it wasn't empty. She found Andrew at the massive dining table overlooking the city. He was back in his armor, a crisp white dress shirt, cuffs rolled up to his forearms, a dark gray vest, and a tie loosened perfectly at his throat. He had a tablet propped up in front of him, a stylus in his right hand, and a cup of black coffee steaming at his elbow. He looked like the CEO she knew, the untouchable phantom of Carter Logistics. But as she stepped into the room, she noticed the slight rigidity in his shoulders, the way his eyes darted from the screen to her, assessing her physical state in a fraction of a second before returning to his work. "There's coffee in the kitchen," Andrew said, without looking up again. "Eggs and toast in the warming drawer." "I'm not hungry." Cindy crossed her arms, lingering at the edge of the dining area. "What happened to David?" Andrew tapped the stylus against the glass screen. "Lucas put him on a Greyhound bus to Cleveland, gave him $5,000 in cash and a very clear understanding of what will happen if he ever crosses state lines into New York again." Cindy blinked. "Cleveland? It's far. It's boring. He'll drink the money away in a month." Andrew finally set the stylus down and looked at her. "He's gone, Cindy. He is no longer a variable in your life." She walked over to the table and pulled out a chair opposite him, sinking into the leather upholstery. She traced the grain of the wood with her thumbnail. "You make it sound like a math problem," she said quietly, "erasing a variable. In my world, everything is a math problem. If a calculation is wrong, people die." He leaned back in his chair, watching her intently. "You're angry. I'm not angry." She frowned, realizing as she said it that it was a lie. She was furious, but not at him. "I'm humiliated. I pride myself on having my life together. I handle your schedule, your shell companies, your ridiculous dietary demands. I fix problems, and yesterday I was cowering in a corner while my ex-boyfriend destroyed my apartment because I didn't have the strength to stop him." "Strength has nothing to do with it." Andrew's voice hardened, dropping into that dangerous register she had heard last night. "He was 100 pounds heavier than you, and armed with a bat. Pragmatism kept you alive. You barricaded the door. You made the call. You survived. I called my boss, she shot back, a bitter smile twisting her lips. Who happens to run half the docks on the eastern seaboard? Most people call 911. Most people wait 20 minutes for a patrol car to show up and write a report over a corpse, Andrew countered, leaning forward, bracing his forearms on the table. You called me because you knew I wouldn't wait. The air between them thickened, heavy and charged. The professional boundary they had maintained for 3 years was completely shattered, lying in pieces on the floor right next to the illusion of Andrew's legitimacy. My sister, Cindy said suddenly, shifting gears because looking into his eyes was becoming too difficult. I have to send her rent money on the 1st of the month. My laptop was smashed. My purse is... She trailed off, rubbing her forehead. Lucas recovered your purse. It's on the kitchen counter, Andrew stated calmly. Your phone is unharmed. I had tech run diagnostics on it to ensure David didn't install any tracking software. As for your laptop, a new one is being delivered this afternoon. I've already wired $5,000 into your sister's account to cover her for the next few months. Cindy's head snapped up. You did what? You can't just wire money to my family. I already did. I'll pay you back. Take it out of my salary. Don't be ridiculous. I'm not being ridiculous, Andrew. I am your employee, not your charity case. You don't own my debts. She stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the wood floor. Her chest heaved. The pragmatic, cynical assistant was gone, replaced by a woman fiercely guarding her last shred of independence. Andrew didn't flinch. He just watched her, his expression entirely unreadable. Then, slowly, he stood up as well. He was much taller than her, casting a long shadow across the polished table. You're right. You are my employee, Andrew said, his voice deadly quiet. But you are also the only person in this God-forsaken city who looks at me without an agenda. You don't try to manipulate me. You don't steal from me. And until last night, you didn't fear me. He walked around the table, stopping a few feet away from her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. I don't care about the money, Cindy. I don't care about the laptop. I care that you are safe. If you want to deduct it from your salary to protect your pride, fine. I'll have payroll draw up the paperwork. He stared down at her, his dark eyes intense and demanding. But don't ever think you have to handle a threat alone again. Not while I'm breathing. Cindy looked up at him. She wanted to throw a sarcastic retort back at him, to rebuild the comfortable wall of snark and professionalism that had always protected her. But the words died in her throat, because beneath the expensive suit and the cold, terrifying reputation, she saw exactly what he was offering. Not charity, not control, absolute uncompromising protection. Okay, she breathed, the fight suddenly draining out of her. Okay. Andrew held her gaze for a second longer, checking for the lie. Finding none, he gave a curt nod. Good. Now, he said, turning back toward the table and picking up his stylus, instantly shifting back into the ruthless machine she recognized. Go eat some toast. We have a hostile takeover meeting at 2 o'clock, and I need you to brief me on the quarterly losses. Fluorescent lights hummed a sterile, irritating pitch that set Cindy's teeth on edge. Tuesday afternoon inside the glass-walled conference room of Carter Logistics felt like a completely different universe from the blood-stained carpet of her apartment. Yet the echo of the violence lingered in her marrow. She sat at the edge of the polished mahogany table, her laptop open, fingers flying across the keys as she transcribed the meeting. She wore a high-collared silk blouse to hide the faint yellowing bruises on her collarbone, and a heavy layer of foundation covered the butterfly bandage near her hairline. To the outside world, she was the flawless, untouchable executive assistant. Inside, every sudden noise made her stomach drop into free fall. Across the table sat Richard Donovan, a maritime freight contractor whose suits were too flashy and whose smile never quite reached his eyes. Donovan was pushing for a larger percentage of the dockside storage fees. He was loud, expansive, and entirely oblivious to the lethal temperature of the room. Andrew sat at the head of the table. He was perfectly still. He hadn't touched his water. He hadn't looked at the 40-page prospectus Donovan had slapped onto the table. He was simply watching the contractor with the cold, unblinking focus of a reptile, deciding whether a meal was worth the effort of unhinging its jaw. "The margins are tight, Artie," Donovan said, leaning back and lacing his thick fingers together. "Fuel costs are up. Union dues are up. You can't squeeze blood from a stone. I need a 10% bump on the storage crates, or I walk. And you know the local unions will walk with me." Andrew didn't blink. "You're asking me to subsidize your gambling debts, Richard. The union dues haven't changed in 3 years. You just lost heavy at the track last month and need to bridge a liquidity gap before your creditors break your thumbs." Donovan's face flushed a dark, ugly magenta. The easy, jovial facade dropped instantly. He slammed his hand flat on the table. Bang! The sound was sharp and violently sudden. It echoed like a gunshot in the confined glass room. Cindy gasped, a harsh, involuntary intake of air, and physically recoiled in her chair. Her elbow struck her coffee cup, sending it toppling over. Dark liquid pooled across the mahogany, dripping onto the sleeve of her silk blouse. She scrambled back, her breath hitching, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. For a split second, she wasn't in a boardroom. She was back in her apartment, and the door was splintering open. Silence slammed down on the room, thick and suffocating. Donovan opened his mouth to apologize, maybe to offer a napkin, leaning across the table toward her. "Whoa, easy there, sweetheart. It's just—" "Don't look at her." Andrew's voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was a razor-thin wire of pure malice that instantly severed all oxygen in the room. Donovan froze, his hand suspended halfway across the table. He slowly turned his head back to Andrew. Andrew was standing now. He hadn't rushed. He simply rose from his chair, a slow, deliberate unfolding of violence. Lucas, standing silently by the door, instinctively dropped a hand to his jacket, his eyes sweeping the room for threats. "Andrew, I was just—" Donovan started, his voice cracking slightly. "You don't speak to her. You don't look at her. You don't breathe in her direction," Andrew said, his voice dropping into a register so dark it made the glass walls feel fragile. He walked slowly around the edge of the table, his eyes locked onto Donovan. "In fact, Richard, I don't think you breathe in my city anymore." Donovan swallowed hard, the color completely draining from his face. "Be reasonable. We've done business for 8 years. You need my trucks." "I own the docks. I can buy new trucks by 5 o'clock, Andrew replied, stopping directly behind Donovan's chair. He didn't touch the man. He didn't have to. The sheer, gravitational weight of his proximity was enough to make Donovan shrink into the leather upholstery. "The deal is void. You are out of the port. You are out of the supply chain. If I see your name on a manifest by Monday, I will have Lucas sink your entire fleet in the harbor, with you in the driver's seat of the lead rig." Donovan scrambled up, nearly tripping over his own chair, his briefcase forgotten on the table. He didn't say another word. He didn't look at Cindy. He practically ran for the glass doors, shoving past Lucas, who stepped aside with a terrifying, polite smile. The door clicked shut. The boardroom was dead silent, except for the frantic clicking of Cindy's heart monitor ringing in her own ears. She stared at the spilled coffee, her hands shaking so badly she had to press them flat against her thighs. She had just cost Carter Logistics a multi-million-dollar distribution network because she got scared of a loud noise. Andrew dismissed Lucas with a subtle jerk of his chin. The bodyguard quietly exited the room, closing the blinds on the glass walls, effectively sealing them off from the rest of the corporate floor. Andrew walked over to the sideboard, grabbed a thick cloth napkin, and moved to her side of the table. He didn't speak. He just began to mop up the spilled coffee, his movements methodical and calm, a stark contrast to the absolute devastation he had just unleashed on Donovan's life. "I'm sorry," Cindy whispered, her voice trembling. "I can fix it. I can draft a concession agreement. I know his deputy manager. I can bypass Richard and—" "Stop!" Andrew tossed the soaked napkin into a wastebasket. He turned to her, leaning his hip against the edge of the heavy table. "There is nothing to fix. Donovan was skimming. I was going to cut him out anyway. He just accelerated the timeline by being a loud, obnoxious idiot." "You lost millions of dollars just now," she said, finally looking up at him, her eyes bright with unshed, frustrated tears. "You don't have a backup fleet lined up. Don't lie to me, Andrew. I manage the ledgers." "Then you know I can afford to lose it," he countered effortlessly. "That isn't the point." She stood up, her frustration finally burning through the lingering panic. "You can't do this. You can't blow up a legitimate corporate deal because someone startled me. I am your assistant. I am supposed to make your life easier, not be a liability." Andrew's jaw tightened, the muscle feathered angrily beneath his skin. "You are not a liability." "I am a cracked glass, Andrew," she argued, pointing a shaking finger at the table. "I flinch when a door shuts too loudly. I jump when the phone rings. I can't even sit in a meeting without having a panic attack. I am broken, and you are restructuring your entire empire to step around the pieces." He closed the distance between them so fast she didn't have time to back away. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a physical wall, entirely boxing her in against the mahogany table. "You are surviving," he said, his voice fierce, dropping the polished corporate mask completely. "You were hunted in your own home, and you survived. I do not care if you flinch. I do not care if you spill coffee. I do not care if I have to burn this entire company to the ground and salt the earth to make sure no one ever raises a hand to you again." Cindy stared at him, her breath catching in her throat. The sheer, overwhelming intensity in his eyes was terrifying. It wasn't pity. It wasn't professional obligation. It was a dark, possessive gravity that threatened to pull her under completely. "You can't protect me from the world," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Watch me," he replied. Cardboard boxes stacked in the corner of the guest room felt like a silent accusation. Thursday night brought a brief reprieve from the humidity, wrapping the penthouse in a cool, artificial chill. Cindy sat cross-legged on the floor, a roll of packing tape in one hand and a stack of folded sweaters in the other. It had been 5 days since the attack. Her apartment was officially vacant. her belongings salvaged by Lucas's crew and dumped in Andrew's spare bedroom. She had spent the last 2 hours scrolling through rental listings on her new laptop, staring at exorbitant deposits for cramped studios in neighborhoods she couldn't afford. She needed to leave. Every night she slept beneath Andrew's roof, the lines of their relationship blurred further. He made her coffee in the morning. He waited for her to fall asleep before he shut the lights off in the hallway. He was dismantling his own ruthless routines to accommodate her trauma, and it was driving her insane. She was a fiercely independent woman who had clawed her way out of a small town, paid for her own degree, and managed the chaotic life of a dangerous man. Becoming his fragile, kept pet was a fate worse than death. Footsteps echoed softly against the hardwood. She didn't have to look up to know it was him. Andrew leaned against the doorframe, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He had shed his suit jacket and tie hours ago. He looked exhausted, the shadows under his eyes dark and bruising. "You're packing," he observed flatly. "I'm organizing," Cindy corrected, ripping a strip of tape with a loud, aggressive screech. "And looking at apartments in Queens. I found a place near Astoria. The commute isn't terrible." Andrew took a slow sip of his drink. The ice clinked against the crystal. "You aren't moving to Astoria. It's relatively safe, and it's within my budget." She didn't look at him, focusing intensely on taping a cardboard flap. "It's a ground floor walk-up with a rusted fire escape, and a landlord who hasn't updated the security cameras since 2014, Andrew said. Cindy froze. She dropped the tape dispenser. It clattered loudly against the floor. She slowly turned her head to look at him, her chest tightening with a sudden spike of anger. "You investigated the listings in my browser history? I had IT flag any residential IP addresses you searched," he answered smoothly, without a single ounce of shame. "I also bought the building in Astoria 2 hours ago. The rents are being tripled tomorrow. It's out of your budget." She scrambled to her feet, the anger boiling over, hot and blinding. "Are you out of your mind? You bought a building just to stop me from renting an apartment? I will buy the entire borough of Queens if it keeps you out of a ground floor unit," he shot back, his calm facade finally cracking. He stepped into the room, setting his glass down hard on the dresser. "You are not going back out there. Not to some cheap, unsecured box where any drunk idiot with a crowbar can kick your door in. I cannot stay here," Cindy yelled, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "I am your employee, Andrew. I am not your wife. I am not your prisoner. You don't get to manage my life like it's a subsidiary of Carter Logistics." "I am trying to keep you breathing," he roared back, the raw volume of his voice making her flinch. He caught himself instantly, his jaw clamping shut, his hands balling into fists at his sides as he fought to reel in the violent temper that governed his underworld life. He closed his eyes for a second, taking a ragged breath. When he opened them, the anger was gone, replaced by something much more dangerous. Desperation. "I cannot do my job if I don't know you are safe," Andrew said, his voice dropping to a low, rough gravel. "For 3 years, I have walked into rooms with killers, thieves, and federal agents, and I have never hesitated. Because I knew that whatever happened, my office was secure. You were there, the one clean, decent thing in my entire miserable existence." He took a step toward her, closing the distance until she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. She didn't back away this time. She stood her ground, her heart hammering against her ribs. "When I heard you crying on that phone, Andrew continued, his eyes locked onto hers, dark and terrifyingly open. When I heard that door break, my entire world stopped. The syndicate, the money, the power. It all meant absolutely nothing. I was utterly, completely helpless. He reached out, his large, calloused hand hovering just inches from her face, wanting to touch her, but terrified he would break her. "I will not feel that way again," he whispered. "I will not let you walk out of here and disappear into a city that wants to chew you up. If you hate me for it, fine. Hate me. But you will be alive to do it." Cindy stared at him, the air thick and heavy in her lungs. She saw the absolute, terrifying truth in his eyes. He wasn't trying to control her out of malice. He was trying to control the universe because he was terrified of losing her. The untouchable Mafia boss was standing in front of her, entirely stripped of his armor, bleeding out on her guest room floor. Slowly, her own anger dissolved, leaving behind a profound, aching sadness. She reached up and closed the gap. She wrapped her hand around his wrist. His pulse was hammering against her palm, fast and erratic. "I don't hate you," she said softly. Andrew let out a shuddering breath, the tension leaving his shoulders in a sudden rush. He turned his hand, threading his fingers through hers, gripping her hand like a lifeline. He stepped closer, eliminating the space between them. He didn't kiss her. He just lowered his head until his forehead rested against hers. "Don't leave," he murmured, the words scraping against the silence of the room. It wasn't an order, it was a plea. Cindy closed her eyes, leaning into his solid, immovable warmth. The pragmatic, sensible part of her brain was screaming that this was a mistake, that you don't anchor yourself to a sinking ship. But as his thumb gently brushed against her knuckles, erasing the lingering chill of the trauma, she knew she had already lost the fight. "I'm not leaving," she whispered into the dark. "But you have to let me buy my own groceries." A low, vibrating chuckle rumbled in Andrew's chest. It was a rusty, unused sound. "Deal!" August dragged a suffocating humidity across the Manhattan skyline, baking the concrete and trapping exhaust fumes in the narrow, shadowed streets. 3 weeks had passed since the broken door. 3 weeks of a strange, fragile domesticity inside the Tribeca penthouse. Cindy hadn't moved out. Andrew hadn't asked her to. They operated in a synchronized orbit, carefully avoiding the gravitational pull of what had happened in the guest room. She returned to work. She insisted on it, fighting Andrew on the point until he finally relented with a jaw so tight it looked ready to fracture. But the parameters had shifted. Lucas drove her now. Her desk was moved from the outer reception area directly into Andrew's private office, separated only by a thick wall of frosted bulletproof glass. She was no longer just the assistant managing legitimate shell corporations. She was inside the bunker, and she started looking at the real ledgers. It happened on a Tuesday. Andrew was out at the Brooklyn shipyards, handling a dispute with a local foreman. Cindy sat at her new desk, scrolling through the distribution routes for Carter Logistics. For years, she had deliberately ignored the glaring inefficiencies in the system, knowing perfectly well that the delayed shipments and empty container waits were deliberate covers for contraband. She had kept her head down. She had played the civilian. But she wasn't a civilian anymore. She was wearing Andrew Carter's protection like a second skin. She pulled up the routing software, her fingers flying across the keys. The routes Andrew was using to bypass customs were archaic. They were bleeding money in bribes and wasting diesel. She spent 4 hours rewriting the logistical pathways, integrating the illicit shipments with heavy machinery imports that Customs and Border Protection rarely flagged for manual inspection. It was a masterpiece of corporate smuggling. When Andrew returned that evening, smelling of salt water and stale cigar smoke, she dropped the printed manifest on his desk. He stared at the paperwork for a long time. The office was quiet, the city humming 30 stories below them. "What is this?" Andrew asked, his voice low, his eyes scanning the columns of numbers. "It's a revised integration route," Cindy said, crossing her arms. She stood on the opposite side of his desk, entirely unapologetic. "You're losing 6% of your gross margin paying off the night shift inspectors at Terminal 4. If you reroute the cargo through the agricultural shipments at Terminal 2, you bypass the human element entirely. Automated scanners don't take bribes. They also don't flag lead-lined crates if they're registered as industrial farming batteries." Andrew slowly looked up from the paper, his dark eyes locked onto hers. He didn't look angry. He looked entirely, profoundly stunned. Lucas, standing by the door, let out a low whistle. "She just saved us $4 million a quarter, boss, and cut our exposure in half." "You shouldn't be looking at these," Andrew said softly, ignoring Lucas. He stood up, resting his knuckles on the desk. "This is the line, Cindy. Once you cross this, you aren't just my assistant anymore. You're an accomplice. You are legally culpable." "I am living in your penthouse," Cindy fired back, her chin raised. "Your bodyguard drives me to get my dry cleaning. I watched you permanently cripple a man in my living room, and I didn't call the police. I crossed the line 3 weeks ago, Andrew. Stop treating me like glass." He stepped around the desk. The space between them evaporated. He looked down at her, searching her face for any trace of hesitation, any lingering ghost of the terror he had seen the night her apartment was breached. There was nothing, just a sharp, intelligent defiance. "You're a terrifying woman, Cindy Stone," he murmured. "I learned from the best," she replied, without missing a beat. The moment hung there, electric and heavy. Andrew reached out, his fingers grazing the edge of her collar, a touch so light it made her breath hitch. Before he could speak, Lucas's encrypted radio buzzed with a sharp static hiss. Lucas pressed his earpiece, his face instantly dropping its casual demeanor, settling into cold, professional stone. He listened for 3 seconds. "Boss," Lucas said, his voice entirely devoid of warmth. "It's Donovan. He didn't take the firing quietly. He just hit the Queen's warehouse, took out 2 of our guys on the loading dock, and torched a shipment." Andrew didn't pull away from Cindy immediately. He closed his eyes, a muscle feathering violently in his jaw. The outside world was dragging him back under. He dropped his hand from her collar. "Lock the building down," Andrew ordered, his voice shifting back to the ruthless executive. He turned to Lucas. "Gather the team. We're going to Queens." "Andrew," Cindy started, the logistical part of her brain instantly recognizing the danger. "Donovan is stupid, but he isn't suicidal. He wouldn't hit a warehouse unless he had backing from a rival syndicate. It's a trap." "I know it's a trap," Andrew said, pulling a heavy, matte black handgun from the safe beneath his desk and checking the magazine. He racked the slide with a sharp metallic crack. "But if I don't respond, the rest of the city thinks I'm soft. And in this business, soft means dead." He walked toward the door, then stopped. He looked back at her, standing in the middle of his office. "Lucas stays with you," Andrew commanded. "You go back to the penthouse. You don't open the door for anyone but me. Understood?" I need Lucas, Cindy argued. He's your best shooter. You take him. Lucas stays, Andrew roared, the sudden volume making the frosted glass rattle. He pointed a finger at the bodyguard. If anything happens to her, Lucas, I will end you. She'll be safe, Andrew, Lucas promised quietly. Andrew gave Cindy one last look, a look that felt entirely like a goodbye, before turning on his heel and walking out into the elevator bank. Cindy stood in the silence of the office, the printed smuggling manifest still sitting on the desk. She realized, with a sickening drop in her stomach, that she was no longer afraid of Andrew Carter. She was terrified for him. Midnight crept into the penthouse, heavy and quiet. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows, a brutal echo of the night everything changed. Cindy paced the length of the slate-gray living room, her bare feet silent against the hardwood. Lucas sat perfectly still by the front door, his weapon resting on his thigh. He hadn't spoken in 3 hours. He was a statue carved from anxiety. At 1:14 a.m., the private elevator chimed. Lucas was on his feet in a microsecond, the gun raised and leveled at the steel doors. Cindy stopped pacing, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. The doors slid open. Andrew stood leaning heavily against the brass railing of the elevator car. His suit jacket was gone. His white dress shirt was completely soaked in dark, heavy blood, clinging wetly to his left side. His face was the color of ash. "Boss!" Lucas breathed, holstering his weapon and rushing forward to catch Andrew as he stumbled out of the car. Cindy didn't scream. The civilian she used to be would have panicked, but that woman had died weeks ago. She moved instantly, sprinting to the kitchen and ripping open the cabinet where Andrew kept the trauma kit. "Couch," she ordered, her voice completely steady, shocking even herself. Lucas hauled Andrew across the room, depositing him onto the pristine gray leather sofa. Andrew grunted, a harsh sound of pain, his head falling back against the cushions. "I'm fine," Andrew gritted out, his teeth clenched. He tried to wave Lucas away. "It's a through and through!" "Shut up!" Cindy snapped, dropping the medical box onto the glass coffee table. She knelt beside him, her hands moving before her brain could catch up. She grabbed a pair of trauma shears and cut straight through the expensive fabric of his shirt, pulling it back to expose the wound. It was ugly, a ragged, bleeding hole just beneath his collarbone. "Did you kill Donovan?" Lucas asked quietly, pressing a thick wad of gauze against the exit wound on Andrew's back. "Donovan won't be setting any more fires," Andrew rasped, his eyes squeezing shut as Cindy poured raw antiseptic directly into the bullet hole. He didn't scream, but his entire body went rigid, the muscles in his neck standing out like steel cables. "You need a hospital," Cindy said, her hands covered in his blood. She pressed a fresh square of gauze over the front of the wound, leaning her entire body weight into it to stop the bleeding. "No hospitals," Andrew choked out, his right hand blindly reaching out until his fingers found her knee, gripping it tight enough to bruise. "Gunshot wound gets reported to the NYPD. I can't afford the heat right now. Just patch it." "I am not a doctor, Andrew," she yelled, the fear finally bleeding through her composure. "You are bleeding on a $30,000 couch and you could die." "I'll buy a new couch," he whispered, opening his eyes. They were hazy with pain, but they locked onto hers with that same terrifying, absolute focus. "And I'm not going to die. I told you I wouldn't leave you alone. I meant it." Cindy stared at him, her breath hitching. The sheer, stubborn gravity of the man was impossible to fight. "Lucas," she said, not breaking eye contact with Andrew. "Get me the needle and the proline sutures from the bottom tray, and pour him a glass of scotch, a large one." For the next 40 minutes, the penthouse was silent except for the ragged sound of Andrew's breathing and the tight, wet sound of the sutures pulling through his skin. Cindy worked methodically. Her hands didn't shake. She anchored herself to the reality of the task, refusing to look at his face, focusing entirely on closing the torn flesh. When she tied the final knot and taped a sterile dressing over the site, she rocked back on her heels, utterly exhausted. Lucas gathered the bloody towels. "I'll make sure the perimeter is secure, boss. Get some sleep." He disappeared down the hall, granting them total privacy. Cindy sat on the floor by the couch, staring at the blood drying on her hands. It was under her fingernails. It stained the cuffs of her sweater. Andrew shifted slowly, propping himself up against the armrest. He reached out with his uninjured arm, his large, warm hand wrapping around the back of her neck. He pulled her gently forward until she was sitting on the edge of the cushion beside him. "You didn't flinch," he observed quietly, his thumb brushing against her jaw. "I'm too tired to flinch," she admitted, leaning into his touch. The adrenaline crash was coming, heavy and absolute. "Is it over? The war with Donovan?" "It's over." Andrew's voice was rough. "He was backed by a crew out of Jersey. They thought I was distracted. They thought I had grown weak because I was spending my time playing bodyguard to my assistant." Cindy swallowed hard. "Am I making you weak?" Andrew let out a low, bitter laugh. He moved his hand from her neck, threading his fingers into her hair, gripping just hard enough to force her to look directly into his eyes. "You are the only reason I bothered coming back to this apartment alive," he said, his voice a dark, raw vibration. "You didn't make me weak, Cindy. You gave me something to burn the city down for." He didn't ask for permission. He didn't hesitate. He leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't a tentative, careful romance. It was desperate, grounded in the violent reality of survival. It tasted like expensive scotch, copper blood, and absolute possession. Cindy didn't pull away. She grabbed the collar of his ruined shirt, anchoring him to her, kissing him back with a fierce, cynical understanding that there was no going back to the light. She had managed his schedule. She had optimized his smuggling routes. She had stitched his bullet wounds. Andrew broke the kiss, his forehead resting heavily against hers. His breathing was ragged, but the violent tension in his shoulders had finally dissolved. "You stay," Andrew ordered softly, a final, unbending decree. Cindy looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the rain hammer against the glass, separating them from the dark, brutal city below. She was standing in the center of the monster's cage, and she had never felt safer. "I'm not going anywhere, boss," she whispered. "Did you feel the adrenaline? If this dark, gritty descent into the Carter Syndicate kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button right now. We bring you high-stakes, deeply human stories where power meets absolute vulnerability. Don't miss out on the next chapter of our underworld sagas. Share this video with someone who loves a slow-burn mafia romance, and subscribe to the channel for more intense cinematic audio drama every single week. Drop a comment below. Would you have pulled the trigger if you were Andrew? Let us know, and stay tuned.